The UFC continues to grow in stock every year with fans all over the world as the organization travels to different locations that have either had fighters who have spearheaded their countries into the UFC sites, like George St. Pierre for Canada and Alexander Gustafsson for Sweden, or that have shown a great pedigree of martial artists that the UFC have then been able to sign, like Brazil and Russia. Today, we look at the top 5 countries the UFC need to go to and that they can ultimately benefit from. Kicking it off at number 5, we have Spain. Obviously, Spain needs to be capitalized on because of Ilia Topuria and him putting his whole country on the map after finishing arguably the GOAT of the featherweight division, Alexander Volkanovski. Dana White recently confirmed that the UFC will debut in Spain later in 2024, which allows for a huge attraction to the UFC crowd-wise, as Ilia has been consistently pushing his first title defense to be at the Santiago Bernabeu in Madrid, which if they can somehow pull off, that's potentially putting 80-odd thousand people in a stadium for a UFC event, which is practically unheard of, not only for an undeveloped country in the MMA world, but for the UFC in general, as their highest capacity event was UFC 243 here in Australia with 57,000 people. Aside from Ilia though, it's also very important for the Iberian Peninsula to get on the map to gain more fighters, as I mean it's definitely lacking in the UFC. We've got Joel Alvarez from Spain being the only other one other than Ilia that is remotely even close to looking at the rankings. And then Portugal's best talent is Manel Cap, who's a top 10 flyweight who's actually doing pretty well. But aside from Manel Cap, we've got the next prospect for Portugal is Andre Fialho, who's just been cut from the UFC. And then the closest to them geographically is actually Benoit Saint-Denis from Nîmes in the south of France, which ultimately just shows how much the far west European region is actually lacking in MMA talent. Hopefully the UFC uses this opportunity with Ilia though later this year to either fight Volk for the rematch or Max Holloway to inspire some more talent in these areas. And I think one of these fights is the best way to do that. Number 4, we have Thailand. When we look at the caliber of fighter in martial arts, specifically in the striking department, it completely overshadows Spain as it's literally the home of Muay Thai. It's an excellent opportunity for not just the UFC, but any organizations, as it allows them to capture the most exciting strikers possibly in the world, which especially is good for the casuals who aren't really ground game enthusiasts. It also can give opportunities to take away from the stereotype that the Thai fighters have no ground game. The UFC already have a huge amount of fighters on the roster like Petr Yan, Rafael Fiziev, Valentina Shevchenko, Volkanovski at times, and just so many more fighters there. Honestly, even just the fighters they have now, just getting their takedown defense on point, I think they have the potential to actually do some damage in the UFC if they can get that working, or just getting their ground game working in general, because we obviously know they've got it there in the striking department. It's definitely the best market to get exciting and durable strikers from. This has been shown especially in 1FC with Rod Tang, Superlek, and Stamp Fairtex in the women's division. Overall, Thailand definitely has the pedigree to do some damage and has some of the most avid fight fans in the world. Moving on, 3rd place, we have Japan. Obviously, we note that the biggest achievement out of Japan was the creation of Pride in 1997. However, Japan just hasn't been the same since it was bought out by the UFC in 2007. And we know it's nowhere near the pedigree that it had throughout those early days with the likes of, the Gracie Hunter, Kazushi Sakuraba, Takanori Gomi, and like Yushin Okami as well. But there is still class coming out of the country, where in the UFC we do have 2 undefeated prospects. We have Rinya Nakamura with a strong wrestling base sitting at 9-0 currently, and Tatsuro Taira entering the UFC's top 15 in flyweight after he TKO'd Carlos Hernandez. Japan is one of the most OG MMA fan bases, and it would definitely be a missed opportunity to recruit more fighters out of Rizin, and also to get a lot of those OG fans back in with more consistent appearances in Japan. Moving on up to number 2, we have China. just like Spain, the opportunity is now to make the most of the country. The UFC has the caliber of fighter to put on a show by getting Weili as a champion to spearhead Fight Night China against, I think, going off my matchups to make video, if you haven't seen that, check that out, against undefeated Tatiana Suarez. That will not only be a huge fight for the strawweight division, as I think it's probably the most competitive matchup they could make there outside Rose Namajunas, who's no longer in the division, but it's also just for the company itself, getting to broaden its audience and to have top 5 fighters like Song Yadong, Yang Xiaonan to solidify themselves in their own country. It's just a huge opportunity for them, as well as having exciting prospects on there like Zhang Ming Yang, and then those who that have just broken into the top 15 like Samaderji. And I prefer that they don't have Weili versus Yan on the China card now, as it allows for more Chinese matchups throughout the actual card itself. It's just giving the chance for Chinese fighters to have more of an undefeated run on the card, which definitely gives the opportunity to inspire more talent in the country. Hopefully this can happen this year, but it looks less likely due to UFC Shanghai being cancelled late last year, and there's just no concrete confirmation that has been put in place for anything this year either. The UFC is definitely able to get the numbers for it with their Road to UFC series and the fighters they've already got. However, they just don't seem to be actioning anything at this point, which, I mean, hopefully just changes soon. Now, before we get to number 1, we have our honorable mention. I'm going to go with the Netherlands. I think it's similar to Thailand, but it's just not as impactful there. I believe that if top fighters that have previously been in the UFC, like Alistair Overeem, Stefan Struve, and UFC champions Bas Rutten and Jermaine Durandamy are anything to go by, then I think it's a great move to return there for the UFC to influence more kickboxing talent especially. Now moving on to number 1. At number 1, we have Africa as a continent, which I just think is an absolute no-brainer. I mean, we have so much talent there at the top with Izzy, Usman, Kennedy Nzechukwu, Sadiq Yusuf coming from just Nigeria alone. And then, of course, we've got Dricus du Plessis as the middleweight champion, putting South Africa on the map. He's got Cameron Simon there as well. And there are 2 major selling points to the African market for the UFC. One being, of course, the inevitable title fight between Izzy and DDP, which we should be getting at UFC 305 in Perth. Now, I'm from Australia, and I would honestly prefer this to headline the first ever Africa card for the UFC. I mean, it's just the perfect opportunity to elevate the continent so much MMA-wise, with the top fighters being available to represent the country. I mean, we've got Yusuf Zalal from Morocco, Themba Gorimbo from Zimbabwe, David Onama from Uganda, and to represent the Republic of Congo, honestly, just chuck Ange Looser in there for a rematch with Brian Battle, why not? And secondly, on top of a stacked card, there is Kamaru Usman with his own promotion over there being AKO, the African Knockout Championship, I believe, which is a great talent pool that the UFC can source from, especially with Dana and Kamaru's relationship. However, I do think the UFC will struggle when it does come to Africa, mainly due to the lack of infrastructure over there. But if they can find a way to pull it off, hopefully being later this year. I mean, we've just got the fighters at the moment that we can really put the card together and actually do it. And Africa ultimately just has the strongest caliber of fighters and potential scenarios to help expand the UFC. Overall, it's fair to say that all these locations have great benefits, not just for the UFC, but the MMA world as a whole. If you enjoyed the content and want more of the same, please like, comment, and subscribe, and enjoy your day.